At 34 years old, I had quietly built the data infrastructure that processed $500 million in transactions every single day, and at my brother's wedding, in front of the man who was about to invest millions in his company, my own family introduced me as the one they were ashamed of. My name is Claire Alderman. I am a senior infrastructure architect at a firm called Veritas Systems, and I have spent the last 7 years building something most people will never see, never understand, and never think to look for. Unless it breaks, it never breaks. That is the whole point. My brother, Nathan, called me the family embarrassment. He said it at his own rehearsal dinner, then again at the wedding reception, loud enough to carry across a room full of people who mattered to him financially. My mother punctuated it with a line she had been honing for years. My father studied his shoes. And the man Nathan had spent months engineering this entire event to impress, Sienna's father, a venture capitalist named Robert Hargrove, worth somewhere north of $40 million, turned very slowly, looked directly at me, and said something so quiet it barely registered a sound. What he said next, what it unlocked, what it cost my brother, what it finally gave me permission to stop absorbing. None of them had seen it coming. Neither had I, entirely, but you need to understand where this story started before you can understand why it ended the way it did. Welcome to Unspoken Drama Stories. Every week we bring you true accounts from women who were overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated, and the moment the truth finally refused to stay quiet. If you have ever been the family member nobody celebrated, this one is for you. Drop a comment below and subscribe if you want to see what happens next. Let me take you back 8 weeks before the wedding. I was sitting in my apartment in Raleigh on a Wednesday evening, reheating leftover soup and reviewing a load, balancing configuration on my laptop, when a notification appeared from a group chat I had been silently removed from 6 weeks earlier. The thread was called Alderman Family, a name my mother had chosen the way she chose everything in her life, with great optimism and no follow-through. They had added me back, no explanation, no apology, just a message from Nathan that read, "Coming to the wedding or not, keep it simple." I had been removed from that chat in January. Not told, not discussed. The little icon had simply vanished one morning while I was on my commute, and it took me 2 days to notice because nobody had been addressing me in it anyway. There were 267 unread messages from the period I had been excluded. Venue logistics. Seating charts, a long thread about centerpieces that my mother had apparently strong opinions on. My name had not appeared once. Below Nathan's message, my mother's Sandra Alderman had typed, "Claire, please confirm. Sienna's family is very precise about these things." Sienna Calloway, Hargrove, Nathan's fiancée. Daughter of Robert Hargrove, founder of Hargrove Capital Partners, a venture firm that had backed 16 companies in the past 4 years. Every single one of them operating in data, infrastructure, and enterprise software. I knew his name the way everyone in my field did. 3 of his portfolio companies ran on architecture that my team at Veritas had designed. The system was called Meridian. I had co-authored 2 of its foundational patents. I did not make that connection immediately. I was too focused on the single line my father had typed below my mother's message. Roger Alderman, a man whose default communication style was silence, had written, "It would mean something, Claire." That was it, 5 words, his longest text to me in 2 years. I set down my spoon. The soup had gone cold. Here is what you need to understand about the Alderman family structure. There was one official success story, and I was not it. Nathan had launched a startup called Forn, a data analytics platform that had raised $12 million, appeared on 4 regional business lists, and earned my mother the ability to recite his accomplishments at every dinner, every church gathering, and every encounter with a neighbor who made the mistake of asking how her children were doing. Nathan was the story she told. I was the footnote she skipped. The last time I had come home for a family dinner, February, a birthday meal for my father, my mother had invited the Hendersons from across the street. Retired couple, warm, curious. Mrs. Henderson asked what I did for work. My mother's hand rose like she was swatting at a moth. "Oh, Claire does something with servers, networks, I think." She turned to Mrs. Henderson before I could correct her. "We don't really talk about Claire's work." She made it sound like a household policy. the same tone she used when explaining why they didn't keep sugary cereal in the pantry. A reasonable limit, nothing personal. Mrs. Henderson looked briefly confused. My father became very interested in his bread roll. Nathan, who had driven up from Chapel Hill in a leased BMW he definitely could not afford without my parents' supplemental support, leaned back in his chair and smiled. The rest of dinner was a curated exhibit on his company. My mother walked the Hendersons through his angel round, his office space, his press mentions, his upcoming pitch to a major venture firm. She did not mention that she and my father had withdrawn $150,000 from their retirement savings to cover a shortfall in his most recent funding gap. I knew about the withdrawal because my father had mentioned it once, nearly inaudibly, during a phone call where I had assumed we were discussing something else entirely. "We believe in him," he had said. "Your mother and I put in what we had, $150,000. 32 years of a high school vice principal's pension and a dental practice administrator's overtime shifts, converted into equity in a company my brother operated and my mother narrated." I said nothing. I had stopped expecting anything different from that house a long time ago. That was not strength. That was surrender dressed up as patience. At Veritas Systems, my title was Principal Infrastructure Architect. I had been there for 7 years. The platform I had designed from the ground up, Meridian, was a real-time data orchestration engine that managed pipeline routing across financial services, logistics, and healthcare clients in 11 states. If you had ever used a payment terminal at a pharmacy or a grocery store in the Mid-Atlantic region, there was a reasonable probability that my code had touched that transaction within the last 4 seconds. Nobody at Veritas sent out announcements about that. My colleague Petra had a running joke that I was the engineer who built the walls of the house while everyone else was busy picking out curtains. I designed the load-bearing structures other people got to decorate. That spring, Veritas' chief technology officer forwarded me an invitation to present at a regional infrastructure summit in Atlanta. My name was on the program beside 2 patents and a keynote panel on distributed pipeline design. I almost declined. I almost always declined. Not because public speaking intimidated me, I had done it regularly, but because I had spent so long making myself professionally invisible that visibility had started to feel like standing in oncoming traffic. My therapist Jenna had a name for it. She called it the competence trap. She said I had constructed a version of my life where I was exceptionally capable and entirely unseen, and that I had organized those 2 things around each other so tightly that I had stopped being able to imagine one without the other. What I told her instead was this: the previous quarter I had designed a failover protocol that saved Veritas' largest client 11 hours of downtime during a critical system migration. Nobody sent a card. Nobody posted about it. But the following morning, when I pulled the overnight diagnostics and saw 0 failed transactions across 14 routing nodes, I felt the particular satisfaction that only people who build invisible things ever get to feel. That was supposed to be enough. I had decided it was enough. 2 weeks after the group chat notification, I drove to my parents' house in Burlington. I told myself it was to drop off a set of air purifier filters my father had mentioned needing. That was partially true. Mostly I went because something in my father's 5-word text had pulled at the part of me that still wanted to believe the word family carried weight in that house. The living room was the same: floral armchairs, the ceramic lamp with the slightly crooked shade that had been slightly crooked for 11 years. And on the mantelpiece a new addition, a tall glass award engraved with the words "Emerging Founder, Carolina Business Review, 2025. It sat between a framed photograph of Nathan shaking hands with someone in a conference room and a candle my mother had never lit. There were no photographs of me on that mantelpiece, not one. Nathan was at the kitchen table when I arrived, eating a sand which our mother had made for him. He was 31 years old. He looked up and grinned the way he always grinned, like he was about to deliver a punchline he found funnier than the audience would. Every family has the one who made it, and the one who makes for a good story. Right, Claire? My mother laughed. My father looked at the window. I set the filters on the counter. Before I reached the door, Nathan caught me in the front hallway. His grin had gone. He kept his voice low, like we were planning something instead of negotiating. "You're showing up to the wedding." "I need you there." When I asked him why, he shrugged, but his eyes were doing something entirely different from his shoulders. "Sienna's father is traditional, wants to see the full picture. Just come, be normal," and he paused. "Don't bring up your work. Don't bring it up at all. Don't bring up your work." The one thing I possessed that was entirely, completely, unambiguously mine. And my brother's instruction was to leave it at the curb like old furniture. What Nathan did not know, standing there in our parents' hallway with his voice low and his eyes calculating, was that 4 years earlier I had given him the spine of his entire company. And I had done it because he was my brother, and I had believed, briefly and naively, that family helped family. It was a Tuesday night in March, 4 years before the wedding. Nathan had called me at 11:30, his voice wound tight with a specific kind of panic that I had come to recognize as the panic of someone who had promised something they could not deliver. He had pitched investors on a proprietary real-time data routing engine. He did not have one. What he had was a pitch deck, a subleased office, and a demo held together with spreadsheet logic and optimism. "I need the core module," he had said, "just something functional. I'll bring in a proper engineering team after the round closes." He was my brother. My mother had called me twice that week to tell me he was under pressure. My father had sent a text, rare enough to be notable, that said simply, "He could use you right now." So I helped. I spent 3 weeks writing a functional data routing prototype. Every line was original, built from first principles, on my personal laptop, on evenings and weekends, completely outside my employment agreement with Veritas. I used my own design logic, my own naming conventions, my own architectural methodology. I wrote clean, modular, documented code because I am constitutionally incapable of writing any other kind. We drew up a consulting agreement. Nathan signed it and promised 2 things, a payment of $12,000 and a co-architect credit in Forn's technical documentation. He paid me $1,800. The credit was never documented anywhere. What did appear 14 months later was Forn's public product page describing its proprietary engine, a system I recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting on an envelope someone else has addressed. Same architecture, same module structure, same variable names in the API documentation. The same internal logic I had sketched out in my apartment at midnight, while Nathan was probably asleep. He had built his entire company on the foundation I had given him. He had renamed the modules, rebuilt the dashboard interface, and pitched it to investors as innovation he had conceived. I said nothing. My mother would have accused me of jealousy. My father would have retreated into silence. Nathan would have looked at me with that particular grin and said something breezy about how family is supposed to help family. So I had closed the browser, filed the documents in a green folder at the back of my filing drawer, and gone back to building things that worked without acknowledgement. The green folder had lived in that drawer for 4 years. Standard manila, recovered with green packing tape after the flap had torn, because I do not throw away damaged things if the contents still matter. Inside it, a printed copy of the consulting agreement with Nathan's signature and mine, dated 4 years back. A PDF of the original commit log, 60, one commits over 23 days, every single one authored by C. Alderman, a 4-page architecture specification written in my own technical shorthand, with margin notes in blue ink and a coffee ring near the upper corner of page 3. And one email from Nathan sent at 2:40 in the morning, subject line, "Can you just get the engine running?" "I'll handle everything else." That email was the last honest sentence Nathan ever wrote to me about Forn. I did not keep the folder as preparation for anything. I kept it because I record my own work, always. It is the same instinct that makes me maintain 3 location backups and label every cable in my workstation. A record is a record. That is all it is. My friend Petra told me not to go to the wedding. We were eating lunch in the Veritas break room, a place that smelled permanently of microwaved soup, and I walked her through the situation. She set her fork down and looked at me with the expression she usually reserved for junior engineers proposing unstable architecture. Why are you doing this to yourself? They treat you like background noise. She was not wrong, but something had shifted in me since February. Maybe it was the therapy. Maybe it was the summit invitation sitting unanswered in my inbox like a small, persistent guilt. Maybe it was just the arithmetic of turning 30, and realizing I had spent an entire decade calibrating myself downward, so the people around me would feel higher by comparison. I said, I am not going to make myself invisible just so everyone else feels more visible. Petra raised one eyebrow. That's remarkably tidy for something that profound. It was also true. I called my mother that afternoon and confirmed I would attend. She sounded relieved in the specific way that had nothing to do with wanting me there, and everything to do with headcount management. Good, the Hargroves are very detail-oriented. Don't bring a guest, nothing too eye-catching, and please don't make references to Veritas or your projects. Nathan can be sensitive when comparisons come up, comparisons as though my career and Nathan's occupied the same competitive lane, as though 7 years of designing distributed infrastructure and 3 years of pitching a borrowed prototype were two athletes running the same race. I stayed on the line for a moment after she finished, listening to the ambient sound of her kitchen. Then I said I would be there, hung up and sat at my desk staring at the cursor blinking on a half-finished configuration file. I almost did not go. If you have ever talked yourself into shrinking just this once, just for the sake of keeping things smooth, you already know exactly what that feels like in your chest. Stay with me, because what happened when I walked into that ballroom was 4 years of silence finding somewhere to land all at once. Subscribe to Unspoken drama stories so you don't miss the moment everything shifted. 3 weeks before the wedding, Foreign was everywhere. Nathan had landed a feature in a regional tech journal under the headline, The Architecture of Ambition, One Founder's Quiet Revolution in Data Intelligence. I read it at my desk during a code review. The article described Foreign's proprietary routing engine as a structural breakthrough in enterprise pipeline orchestration. The technical framing they quoted from Nathan, the way he described module hierarchy, dependency resolution, latency distribution, was drawn almost verbatim from the architecture specification I had written for him 4 years earlier, not the spirit of it, the actual construction. The article also noted that Foreign was in advanced discussions with Hargrove Capital Partners for a significant series around. Robert Hargrove, Sienna's father, whose fund already licensed Meridian, my system, my architecture, through 3 of his portfolio companies. I knew this because Veritas' VP of Client Partnerships had mentioned it in a Monday stand-up meeting just 2 weeks earlier. Hargrove apparently reviewed our architecture documentation himself when his firm first signed on. He had told our sales team it was the most coherent system design he had encountered in over 15 years of evaluating data infrastructure. That was my work. The irony was not subtle. It was like watching someone walk into a gallery wearing a painting they had cut out of its frame and announce they were the artist. My mother posted the article link in the Alderman family chat with a string of celebration icons and the words, "Our boy delivered again." 14 family members responded with hearts and fire symbols. I did not react. Nobody noticed. That same week, Nathan appeared on a regional startup podcast. I listened to 38 minutes of him describing technology he had not built, using terminology I had introduced him to, solving problems I had documented in my own technical shorthand. He sounded polished, he sounded like a founder, he sounded like a man who had rehearsed the story so many times he had stopped being able to distinguish it from memory. The worst part, the part that made my hands grip my mug, was that the engine he described was real. Functional, scalable, because I had made it real. I was simply no longer part of the story it was being told inside. My mother called on a Thursday evening while I was reviewing a network failover plan for Veritas' second quarter migration. She had that particular quality in her voice she reserved for conversations where she needed cooperation without inviting questions. Meredith, she still called me Meredith sometimes when she was anxious. It was my grandmother's name, and she defaulted to it under pressure. I need you to understand something about the Hargroves. Robert is not the kind of man who overlooks things, so when you're at that wedding, I need you to be supportive. Not polite, supportive, don't say anything technical, don't bring up Veritas, and please, she paused, just let Nathan have this. For once, as though I had ever competed with him for anything, as though I had ever taken a single thing from Nathan's table. I wanted to ask her when exactly she thought I had attempted to claim anything. I wanted to ask what she felt every time she waved her hand and told a stranger she did not brag about me. I wanted to ask if she had done the math on what she and my father had put into foreign verses, what they had ever offered me. But I already knew the shape of the answer. My mother had grown up without margin. Her father had managed a loading dock. Her mother had cleaned offices on an overnight schedule. Nobody in her family of origin had built anything that lasted. Sandra Alderman had spent her adult life in quiet terror of being ordinary, and she had selected Nathan as her evidence against it. If she ever acknowledged that I was the one who had built something genuine, she would have to acknowledge 30 years of misallocated investment. That was a debt too expensive to carry, so she covered it with my silence instead. I did not argue. I set my laptop aside and said I would behave appropriately. 10 days before the wedding, a message arrived in my professional email from someone named Marcus Webb, lead technical analyst at Hargrove Capital Partners. The message was brief, neutral in tone, and extremely precise. MS Alderman. Our firm is currently conducting technical due diligence on a portfolio candidate in the enterprise data infrastructure space. During our review, we identified architectural patterns and structural conventions that correspond closely to documentation attributed to your published work on Meridian at Veritas Systems. We would appreciate a direct conversation to clarify questions of authorship and provenance. This is a routine component of our diligence process. Please indicate your availability this week. I read it 3 times. My pulse stayed level. Years of reading system alerts under time pressure had given me that. But my hands were already moving. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I took out the green folder. I laid it flat on the surface in front of me and lifted the cover for the first time in over a year. The consulting agreement, Nathan's signature uneven and hurried across the bottom. Mine neat, dated 4 years earlier. The commit log, 60. 1 entries across 23 days. Every line, see Alderman. The architecture specification, 4 pages in my own handwriting, blue ink margin notes. Coffee ring on page 3. Nathan's email, 2:40 in the morning. Can you just get the engine running? It had all been there. Sitting in a folder in a drawer, waiting for nobody, because I had never intended it to be used as anything other than a record of what I had made. The difference now was that it sat at exactly the intersection of my brother's pitch and an investor's due diligence process. I had not placed it there. The truth had simply located its own address. I did not reply to Marcus Webb that afternoon. I spent 2 full days sitting with the weight of what answering would mean, not because the answer was complicated. The answer was clean and simple. Yes, I wrote the architecture. Here is the documentation. The weight was in the arithmetic surrounding it. If I confirmed authorship to Hargrove's analyst, the due diligence flag would become a wall. An unresolved IP provenance issue in a series around is not a procedural delay. It is a disqualifying event. Foreign's funding round would stall or dissolve. The company built on the engine I had given my brother would face the kind of scrutiny that borrowed narratives cannot survive. The investment my parents had made, $150,000 from 32 years of savings, would be in serious jeopardy. And they would blame me. My mother would call it sabotage from jealousy. My father would disappear into a silence that felt worse than any accusation. Nathan would tell everyone within reach that his sister had destroyed his company because she could not tolerate his success. I sat at my desk for a long time looking at the cursor on my screen. Then I opened a blank document and typed 1 sentence that I sent to no one. It was just for me. I will not misrepresent my own work. That was the whole of it. I was not going to reach out to Hargrove Capital unprompted. I was not going to march into Nathan's office with the green folder. But if Marcus Webb asked me a direct question about code that I had written on my own time with my own methodology, I was going to tell the truth. I was not going to lie about my own work, not for Nathan, not for my mother, not for a family that had spent a decade treating my existence as something to apologize for. I replied to Marcus Webb. I said I was available Wednesday. The rehearsal dinner was held at an event venue outside Raleigh. White linen, ambient string lighting, handwritten place cards by a professional calligrapher. I found mine at a table near the back of the room, positioned between a distant cousin I had met twice and a university friend of Sienna's who spent the evening watching something on her phone. The table, Nathan and Sienna sat at the head table with Robert Hargrove and Sienna's mother, Catherine. My parents were at the adjacent table, close enough to be seen in proximity to the Hargroves, far enough to suggest they understood the hierarchy. When Nathan stood to introduce the room, he worked the space with the easy fluency of someone who had practiced charm, the way I practiced code reviews. Through repetition, refinement, and relentless iteration, he introduced his parents with warmth. He introduced the Hargroves with reverence. When he reached me, he paused just long enough to land it. "This is my sister Claire. She works with computers." A polite scatter of smiles. At a table near the side wall, a man with close, cropped gray hair and round wire, frame glasses, name badge I couldn't read from across the room, tilted his head very slightly when he heard my name. Not a double take, more like a word snagging on something familiar in a sentence you've heard before. The evening moved on, toasts were given. Nathan told a story, lightly edited for maximum charm, about how Forn had nearly failed to launch until someone pulled an all-nighter to get the core engine running. He used the phrase stroke of luck and smiled at the ceiling. He did not say whose hands had been on the keyboard. I ate my dinner. I did not correct the record. After the guests began dispersing toward the parking lot, the man with the wire, frame glasses passed my table and stopped. "MS Alderman," he said my name carefully, like he was verifying a label. "I saw your name on the distributed pipeline panel in Atlanta." The orchestration session. I said yes. He nodded once, something registering behind his eyes, and walked out. I never learned his name that evening, but someone in that room had recognized mine independently, for reasons that had nothing to do with Nathan. On the drive home, the connections I had been holding separately clicked into alignment, not all at once. Gradually, like a system coming online after a restart, one node at a time. Nathan had not invited me to his wedding because he wanted me there. He had invited me because he needed Robert Hargrove to see a complete, stable, unremarkable family. A family that presented well and asked no inconvenient questions. But more specifically, he needed me to be publicly and visibly diminished. If Marcus Webb's report ever surfaced my name in a conversation with the Hargrove team, Nathan needed the room's memory of me to already be coded as the insignificant one, the quiet background figure, the sister who did something vague with computers, the one her family did not talk about. If I was already labeled and set aside in everyone's social memory, then anything I said later about Forn's architecture would read as bitterness, as resentment, as a failure trying to contaminate. A success, that was the strategy, not a written plan. Nathan was not a planner, but he had the instincts of someone whose survival had always depended on controlling how the story was told. And the story required me in the room, in the background, wearing my assigned role like a printed name tag. What Nathan did not know, what none of them knew, was that Hargrove Capital's technical team already had my name in their report. The due diligence had already begun, and the architect flagged for provenance review was not a nameless former contractor or a disgruntled ex-employee. She was sitting at a back table at her brother's rehearsal dinner, eating sea bass, being introduced as the family footnote. The collision was already in motion. I had not started it. I had simply finally stopped being willing to deny what I had built. The wedding was held at the Hargrove family estate, 17 acres, a stone manor house with Virginia creeper climbing the east wall, a reception hall with limestone floors and cathedral ceilings that made every sound feel considered, a string quartet near the entrance playing something baroque and perfectly calibrated, champagne moving on silver trays through a room that had been designed, from the threshold inward, to communicate the particular confidence of inherited wealth, I arrived at 4 wearing a navy dress I had purchased 2 years earlier for a conference I had ultimately not attended. Clean lines, nothing decorative except my grandmother's watch. My mother, in an earlier call, had strongly implied I should wear something that would not attract notice. I wore what I wanted to wear because I had decided, somewhere between the rehearsal dinner and that morning, that I was finished curating myself for her comfort. The ceremony was short and genuinely beautiful. Sienna was luminous in the specific way of someone who has found exactly what she wanted. Nathan cried on cue. My parents sat in the second row, my mother in a sage green suit purchased specifically for the occasion, my father in a tie that almost matched his jacket. They looked like proud parents. They looked like people who had invested everything in this moment. I sat 5 rows back between people I did not know, watching my brother marry a woman whose father was simultaneously being asked by his own technical team whether the engine powering Nathan's company was actually Nathan's to sell. Picture it, limestone floors, a string quartet, and me in the row where the background characters sit. I almost left before the reception began. If you have ever stood at the edge of a room asking yourself whether you are allowed to take up space in it, stay with me. Because what the bride's father said to my brother's family in the next 2 hours rearranged everything. Comment your reaction below if you are already feeling this. The reception opened at 6. Tables were arranged in gradual arcs around a central dance floor. My seat was at the outer ring, table 12, positioned near a side corridor and a large potted arrangement that I suspected was there to absorb whatever energy the table might generate. Nathan had assigned the placement. He told me this while intercepting me near the bar, his hand briefly on my elbow, the kind of touch that steers more than it greets. "You're at 12, great view of everything," he smiled, a prop being positioned on a set. He introduced me to Sienna's aunt as his tech support sister. He introduced me to a groomsman as the quiet one. He introduced me to a couple near the champagne station as the family bookworm who barely comes up for air. Each introduction was a careful, practiced calibration, warm enough to land as humor, precise enough to be a category assignment. My parents followed behind us at a half step. My mother smiled after each introduction. My father looked at the floor. When Sienna's mother asked me what I did professionally, my mother answered before I had finished drawing breath. She handles technical support, I think, servers or something of that nature. She said it with the absolute confidence of someone who had been delivering the line for so long it had stopped feeling like a misrepresentation. I let it settle, I let all of it settle, but when Nathan squeezed my arm again and bent close to whisper, "Nobody is going to remember any of this, Claire." Stop tensing up. I pulled my arm away, not loudly, not theatrically, just enough for him to register the absence of my cooperation. "You can introduce me," I said, keeping my voice even. "But you do not get to write what I am." He blinked. Then the grin came back, the one that had been deflecting accountability since we were children. "Relax. It's a celebration." He walked away. I stood exactly where I was, back straight, no performance, just still. Robert Hargrove entered the reception at 6:40. He had been finishing photographs with the wedding party, and his arrival changed the room's atmosphere the way barometric pressure changes before rain, subtle, pervasive, felt before it is understood. He was taller than I had expected, composed in the way of men who have been reading people in high-stakes rooms for a long time. He wore his suit without ceremony. His handshake when he greeted people was brief and unornamented. He did not smile, unless something actually warranted it. Sienna guided him toward the table where my parents were already seated, champagne raised, performing their most polished version of a family with nothing complicated to explain. Nathan materialized beside them immediately, louder, more luminous, describing a new partnership announcement for Forn that I happened to know was still in letter of intent status and had not been finalized. Robert listened. He did not nod. He did not fill the silence with encouragement. He watched Nathan the way a structural engineer watches a building under unexpected load, looking for the place where the stress would eventually concentrate. I was not supposed to be anywhere near that circle. My table was on the other side of the room. But I had stopped at the bar for water, and the bar sat between them and me, and Nathan saw me before I could move. His eyes caught on me the way eyes catch on something useful. "Dad," he said it to Robert, "come meet my sister." "You haven't yet?" He said it the way someone pulls a chair into a frame for a photograph, functional. Purposeful, not warm. Robert turned. My parents adjusted in their chairs. Nathan put one hand on my shoulder and held his champagne glass with the other, positioned himself between us with the proprietary ease of a man arranging his own stage, and then said it clearly, enough for 3 nearby tables to hear. "This is our family embarrassment." He laughed. A few people in earshot offered polite smiles. One woman at a nearby table looked at her husband. My mother, from her chair 3 feet away, leaned slightly toward Catherine Hargrove and delivered her line with the practiced lightness of a woman who has said it so many times it no longer sounds like what it is. "We don't publicize Claire." She said it the way a person describes a house rule, neutral. Settled above interrogation. My father looked at the tablecloth. Nathan squeezed my shoulder. I did not move. I did not flinch. I did not arrange my face into the patient, good-natured expression I had worn for 34 years to signal that the joke was fine, that I was fine, that none of it accumulated into anything that mattered. I stood with my shoulders level and my hands at my sides and my expression exactly as it was, present, clear, and finished. 34 years of being the punchline, I was done cueing the laughter. Robert Hargrove had not spoken. He had watched Nathan deliver the line. He had watched my mother add hers. And now he turned slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has decided to redirect his full attention, and looked directly at me. Not at Nathan, not at my mother, at me. His expression changed, not dramatically, no sharp intake of breath. But his brow drew slightly together, his jaw tightened at the hinge, and he went very still in the way of someone whose internal calculation has just encountered a variable that was not in the model. He spoke quietly. The string quartet had paused between movements, and his voice reached further than the immediate circle. "So it is you. I did not expect this." 4 words, that was all. Nathan's smile stayed on his face the way a light stays on after the switch is cut, briefly, then noticeably wrong. "What?" he said. His voice had shifted. "Do you know each other?" Robert did not look at Nathan. He was still looking at me, recalibrating. "Alderman," he said. "Veritas Meridian," I said. "Yes, that's me." Your system handles transactions for 11 of my portfolio companies. 12, I said. ClearPath Health migrated onto Meridian in February. Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Something behind his eyes ran a quiet calculation. My analyst Marcus flagged a provenance concern in his report last week. He said, more to himself than to the room. I assumed the C. Alderman on the authorship records was a former contractor, someone tangential. He looked at Nathan once, then back at me. You are his sister, yes, and you authored the foundational architecture that Forn's engine is built on. I did not hesitate, I did not soften, I did not add qualifications designed to protect anyone in the surrounding radius. I wrote the original routing engine, I said. The consulting agreement is dated 4 years ago. The commit history carries my name across every entry. The architecture specification is in my handwriting. The IP was never formally transferred to Forn. I built the system on my personal equipment on my own time, and the contract my brother signed was never honored in full. I was not performing, I was not delivering a speech I had prepared. I was answering a direct question with documented facts. That was all I had ever needed. The circle went still, not silent. There were still glasses meeting across the room, still the low current of a reception in full motion. But the cluster around us, Nathan, my parents, Catherine, Robert, and me, had become its own sealed atmosphere. Nathan moved first. He stepped between Robert and me, his posture shifting from polished founder to something rower and less managed. Hold on. This is exaggerated. She provided some early drafts, that is all. Everything Forn has become, the product, the platform, the engineering team, that is my work, my direction. She wrote some starter code 4 years ago. He looked at Robert with a version of the grin that had, until this evening, solved most of his problems. You understand how this goes. Family members always inflate their contribution after the fact. Robert tilted his head. The load distribution logic in your core pipeline. Marcus's report identified it as structurally identical to a module published in a Veritas white paper 3 years ago. He paused. Can you walk me through how the adaptive latency threshold is calibrated in your system? Nathan opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at me across the space between us with the recognition of a man who has been running on borrowed momentum and has just heard the engine stop. My mother rose from her chair. Robert, please, she said. There is a time and a setting for Roger. My father's voice, quiet her name, she stopped. Robert looked at me. MS Alderman, I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Is the core infrastructure of Forn your original work? Yes, and I will not pretend otherwise, not for anyone. I said it the way I would answer a specification question during a technical review, flat, exact, without editorial weight on either end. The core routing engine of Forn is a data pipeline, prototype I designed over 3 weeks 4 years ago. The architecture follows a specification I wrote independently. The commit history is entirely mine. The consulting agreement my brother signed was not honored, no full payment, no attribution. The intellectual property was never assigned. I built it on my own time using my own methodology, and it was taken without credit. I was not shaking. I was not tearful. I was not triumphant. I had simply stopped lying by omission, which is its own specific relief. Nathan's face had gone dark red. You set this up. You came here specifically to destroy this. I came because your family asked me to. You planned this whole. I planned nothing, I said. I do not lie about my own work. That is the only position I have ever taken. The IP was never assigned, Robert said, cutting across Nathan's next sentence with the quiet authority of someone who has been making final determinations in rooms like this for 30 years. If Forn does not hold clear ownership of its core architecture, the investment cannot proceed as structured. This is due diligence. It is not personal. My mother's face had gone to chalk. My father was looking at me, not with anger, I want to be precise about that, but with the expression of a man who is being introduced to a version of a story he had never been told. The full version, the string quartet had started again, something slow and looping, a piece built on a repeating motif that circles back to its own beginning without ever fully resolving. It floated over the silence between us like something neither patient nor unkind. Nathan moved toward the display table near the entrance. I do not think it was fully decided in his mind. I think he was reaching for something to hold proof, maybe, that the room had been wrong, that the glass trophy with his name on it meant more than a commit log in a green folder. The award from the Carolina Business Review, the one that had lived on my parents' mantelpiece like a reliquary, and had been transported to the venue as carefully as a family heirloom. He picked it up. His hands were not steady. It slipped. It hit the limestone floor and shattered with the specific clean crack of dense glass on hard stone. The sound moved through the reception the way certain sounds do, not loud, but total, reaching every corner before the room could decide how to respond. Sienna had been dancing with her cousin on the far side of the floor. She stopped. She stood in the center of the room with her dress pulled around her feet and looked at the man she had married that afternoon. Her expression was not anger. It was the expression of someone running the same numbers twice and arriving at a different answer. Nobody moved. The quartet played. On the limestone floor, amid the scattered glass, the word founder was still legible on the largest remaining fragment. My mother recovered first, not with grief, but with strategy. She crossed the room in her sage, green suit, heels sharp on the stone, and moved toward Robert with the specific energy of a woman who has spent a lifetime managing perception after the fact. Robert, please, you have to understand, Claire has always had a complicated relationship with Nathan's success. She paused, hunting for the right framing. She tends to see competition where there is none. Mrs. Alderman, Robert's voice was measured, not dismissive, just clear. The system your daughter built is licensed by my fund across 12 companies. Her published technical work is referenced in 4 industry papers. The platform she designed processes more daily transactions than any product currently in my portfolio. He paused. I don't know what she is in your family. In my industry, she is considered among the best infrastructure architects in this region. My mother's mouth opened, closed. She looked at me the way she had not looked at me in a very long time, directly, as though she was trying to reconcile 2 incompatible pictures she had been holding of the same person. And for one fractional, unguarded moment, I saw something beneath the composure, not remorse, fear. The clean, specific fear of a woman who has built a story about her family for 30 years and has just watched a credible stranger dismantle it with verifiable facts in under 90 seconds. Then her face closed again, and she said it, the last resort. Even with Nathan's award in pieces on the floor, even with the investor withdrawing, even with the room watching, she found a way to return it to me. Well, if she is so accomplished, why didn't she say something sooner? Why didn't she do more to help her brother properly? There it was. I did not argue. There was nothing to argue with. The green folder existed. The commit log existed. The consulting agreement existed. I had not brought them to the wedding because I had not needed to. The truth had run its own audit. I had simply answered when asked. The money surfaced the way money always does in families that have placed their whole future on a single outcome, not in a formal conversation, but in a hallway hushed between courses, with voices pitched just below the level of the surrounding noise. My father found me near the coat room. His tie was loose. His eyes were wet in the way of a man who is not accustomed to crying and is fighting the impulse on principle. The investment, Claire, your mother and I, $150,000. We put everything behind him. I know, I said. Is it gone? I don't know what Foreign has left without this round. That depends on how much of the structure was real. He leaned against the wall. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and had just been told the thing he was carrying was not what he thought it was. He looked older than 60. He looked like my father, which is a different thing entirely. My mother appeared at the corridor's end. She walked toward us with the momentum of someone who has identified a problem and arrived to resolve it. Meredith, you have to help fix this. I didn't break it, Mom. You didn't have to come. You could have stayed away. You put me on the guest list. You added me back to the chat. You needed me there. She stopped. Something moved briefly behind her eyes, a flicker of recognition quickly covered. I just wanted one thing to be proud of, she said. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, genuinely cracked. It was the most unguarded she had been with me since I was a child. Then her shoulders squared, her expression reset. She said, "You should have stayed quiet. You owed us that at least," and she walked away. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked toward the front entrance. Robert Hargrove was standing under the portico when I stepped outside. His jacket was still on. His hands were in his pockets. Behind him, through the glass doors, the reception was continuing, diminished in energy, reconfigured in direction, but continuing. "Ms. Alderman," I turned. He stood a measured distance away, composed but deliberate. "I want to be direct with you. The investment in foreign is not proceeding. That decision had already been made based on the technical review before tonight. What happened in there did not change the outcome. It compressed the timeline." I nodded. "I also want to acknowledge something. I should have connected the attribution records to the name sooner. Marcus's report was thorough. The authorship was unambiguous. I should have reached out to you directly before this situation came to a head in a public setting. I apologize for that. You didn't know I was his sister, no, but I knew Alderman was a real person who had built something real. I should have found you first." He paused. "For whatever it carries, your work speaks clearly for itself." "It always has. I did not need Robert Hargrove's validation. I had built Meridian without anyone's approval. I had built 7 years of career in rooms where no one in my family knew my name was on the whiteboard. But hearing it said plainly by a person who understood the weight of what had been built, that was not nothing. I said, "Thank you." He nodded. I walked to my car. I had come because I was summoned. I was leaving because I chose to. The aftermath arrived the way data arrives after a system event, not all at once, but in structured intervals, each packet adding resolution to an outcome that had always been inevitable once. Right question was asked. Hargrove Capital Partners formally withdrew from foreign series within 72 hours. The stated reason in their communication was clean and professional, unresolved intellectual property provenance. In the data infrastructure investment world, that language is its own verdict. 2 additional investors who had been signaling commitment quietly declined within the following 10 days. The regional journal that had profiled Nathan as a quiet architectural revolutionary ran a significantly less flattering follow-up piece that asked pointed questions about the provenance of Foreign's core engine. Foreign did not dissolve overnight. These things rarely do, but the scaffolding was gone. What remained was a company without clear IP ownership of its central technology, without its lead investor, and without the narrative that had been structuring its credibility. The wedding was postponed. Sienna returned to her family's estate. Whether she and Nathan had meaningful conversations after that evening is not something I tracked. It was not mine to track. In the Alderman family chat, the one I had been removed from, reinstated into, and never genuinely included in, my parents sent me 2 messages over the following week that had nothing to do with Nathan. My father wrote, "Are you all right, Claire?" 4 words, his equivalent of a letter. My mother wrote nothing for 5 days then. "You could have spoken to us privately." I replied once, "I am open to a real conversation when it begins with honesty, not before." Nobody responded immediately. That was fine. I was not waiting. I was drawing a boundary, the kind that should have been drawn a decade earlier, the kind that is only possible once you have stopped believing you deserve the treatment you have been accepting. I went back to Veritas on Monday morning. Meridian was running exactly as it had been running on Friday. 500 million daily transactions, 11 states, no recognition from anyone who did not have a reason to look at the architecture logs. Petra brought me coffee and did not ask about the wedding. She just sat at the edge of my desk and looked at me for a moment. "You look like someone who finally put something down that was very heavy." I laughed for the first time in a week. The Atlanta Summit invitation was still in my inbox, the panel on distributed pipeline architecture. I accepted it that afternoon, not because Robert Hargrove's words had granted me permission,